Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. If this is your first time listening, you're in for a treat. Here at Grief Refuge, we hold sacred space for your grief. It gets honored, and you're invited to explore the deeper understandings of your process and grief journey. You'll find Grief Refuge to be different from other grief-related podcasts. Instead of scratching the surface about grief, we go deeper, much deeper. Grief can be very emotional and overwhelming. My intention here is to be a soothing voice as you navigate this terrain of emptiness, loneliness, and uncertainty. I appreciate your listenership, regardless whether this is your first or your 50th time listening. I sincerely hope you feel more comforted, supported, and cared for as you take another step on your journey. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while you're listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for self-care and reflection. Use this time to relax and allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. Please use this time to mourn your loss. In addition to what you're about to hear, I also invite you to download the Grief Refuge app. On the app, there are more stories, reflections, perspectives, and insights, all for healing and processing grief. The Grief Refuge app is a free download and it's really easy to find. Just search Grief Refuge on whatever app store you use. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. Today I have something very important to share with you about grief. It's uncommon in topic, but yet so special. Actually, it's not uncommon, but it's more common to honor someone as you grieve. What I'm about to share next is more focused on honoring your own grief, which has some similarities and has some differences to honoring a loved one who's died. Enjoy this special feature for how to honor your grief. When you're grieving, it can be helpful to honor the person you lost. There are many ways to do so, from what is physical and tangible to what's digital and virtual. Some examples are acts of kindness at or with charities that were important to the person you lost, planting a tree in their honor, or creating a digital memorial. I find myself feeling appreciation for the many times I approach a park bench and I see an engraving or a plaque attached, honoring someone who made a difference in that geographical area. Honoring a loved one helps with your grieving process. It's an act of mourning that may help with accepting their death and shifting several thoughts towards life moving forward. In addition to helping with your own grief, it helps create a legacy for your loved one, and that can feel really good too. In the grieving process, honoring a loved one isn't the only thing that you can honor. You can also honor your grief. This may sound weird or uncommon, but it's also something known to help with the healing process. What does it mean to honor your grief? When you think about honoring a loved one, you essentially are doing something to show your love and respect for them. Can the same type of thing happen to honor your own grief? The word honor means to recognize the value of, and it also means to respect. Grief may make you feel something that I like to call duality, where you're struggling with the way you feel, but you're also sensing that what you're experiencing, this needs to happen. I've also heard of this being called tending to your grief. You may be told to hold space for it, but it causes pain, and then you may find it confusing or unmeaningful to give it this respectful attention, to honor it. My grief mentor, Dr. Alan Wolfelt, has stated, "To honor your grief is not self-destructive or harmful. It is courageous and life-giving." Honoring your grief is counterintuitive, and it isn't something taught in most grief support-related programs. Because it's very uncommon, I agree with Dr. Wolfelt that it is a courageous act. I can understand the resistance that you may feel to recognize value and respect something that can feel so painful. But when you're honoring your grief, you're respecting it as something important in your life. I believe that grief shows up as a teacher in times of hopelessness and despair. Grief, it's a teacher of many things. And I don't see grief as a teacher in the ways that are purely academic. Your feelings are just as important as your thoughts, for they are part of the authentic grief experience. So, what I mean by grief as a teacher is in a holistic sense: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and social. Honoring your grief is paying attention to it as a part of you that has a purpose and a point to it. It's also listening to it, feeling it, and expressing it. Instead of dismissing or numbing grief, honoring it may be an important thing in helping make what feels unbearable more bearable. How can honoring your grief help? There are theories that when your heart breaks, it can be physical and physiological just as much as it can be emotional and metaphorical. If your grief remains unattended and dishonored, it may become a source of heartaches or more serious physical body-related problems. As you learn ways to honor your grief, you may come to understand some of the ways it can open pathways to healing in your heart and soul. Honoring your grief may actually help you mourn in less time, and it can actually help you come to a place of peace and acceptance for your loss. Honoring your grief is also a way to show self-love and respect. In my own experience, feeling the depths of despair of grief opened me to ways of better caring for myself and loving myself more unconditionally. When you honor your grief, you create a sanctuary for your healing. Internally, you establish a safe place to feel the authentic arrangement of emotions and gain a deeper understanding of what your grief experience means as you move forward in life. Healing is a journey of navigating through darkness and light, as is grief. How to honor your grief. In the companioning work I do, I often ask clients, if your grief had a voice, what would it say? I find the exercise to surprise people because it's a perspective of grief that's not normally thought about. But this perspective, it honors grief. So that's why I asked the question. My intention is to help someone see their own grief as something that does have a voice. Even within yourself, one part of you may need to express an aspect of your grief, and another part of you may need to witness it. Now you may be thinking, parts of me? Yes, there are parts of you. Human makeup is very complex, just as complex as grief. There are parts of you, mostly in your psyche, to have louder voices when encountering different life events. As an example, would you say that you find yourself to be confident? If you answered yes, that confident part of you will speak up in times of uncertainty. I can do this. This may be a normal response to several different situations. When grief needs to speak, it may be from this vulnerable or timid part of yourself. And if your tendency is to ignore or suppress vulnerability, you may shut down or cut off that part of yourself from speaking. But when grieving, you'll have to stop yourself from doing so. Your conscious mind will have to allow or hold space for that timid, vulnerable part of your grief to speak. In order to honor your grief, you have to slow things down. You have to give it room to be heard. And you also have to believe that as painful as it may feel, grief has a significance in your life. Now, if you've listened to other Grief Refuge podcast episodes, I know you know that I'm a proponent of nature. Nature provides a sanctuary where stillness and movement can exist at the same time. I've had the personal experience that when in nature and without mobile technology, no matter where I go or what I do, I can sort through grief-related thoughts and feelings without distraction or the pressure to perform or to achieve. How can you honor your grief? There are numerous ways to do so. Remember that even in the honoring of your loved one, it's also possible to honor your grief at the same time. Here are a couple suggestions for how to honor your grief. Start a tradition. There are many new things you can do to comfort your grief. The point is that whatever you start, it's important to find it comforting and not dreadful. For example, at Thanksgiving time, my wife and I place photos of deceased relatives on our mantle. We keep them up until the new year. We love this tradition. We find it to be comforting in the feeling of staying connected to family during the holidays. Sit in sacred silence. As I mentioned earlier about slowing things down to honor your grief, I also advocate for moments of silence when you're alone. In moments of silence intended to honor your grief, there's a sense of sacredness, and the feeling is quite comforting. I'm fortunate to be able to do this along the Pacific coast, but even if you're surrounded by land, you can sit in sacred silence at a local park or along the banks of a river near you. Many people in the Grief Refuge community have stated how healing it is for them to sit in sacred silence near flowing water. Write your grief. You may already be doing this, but you might not be giving yourself the credit for it. Many people think of writing as something prolific, like completing a memoir or filling the pages of a journal each day. This is great, but any person who's grieving doesn't have to hold this expectation of themselves. Writing your grief can be really simple. You can write 2 bullet points on a Post-it note, just keeping tallies of some of your feelings or thoughts. Then you could take it as far as you want. You could write letters to your loved one, or you can even write letters to yourself from their perspective. The possibilities are endless, and similar to grief itself, there's no right or wrong way to write about grief. The hope is that you do something. Write anything that feels comforting. Write in any way, shape, form, or style that supports your healing and honors your grief. You never know what may come up. There could be an insight or an awareness that could be exactly what you need for your healing. So what comes up for you as a way to honor your grief? Hopefully, what's been shared here has helped spark some ideas for you. If you are still unsure of what may help, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. In summary, you've heard about the ways to honor your grief, what it means, how it can help, and how to do it. Honoring your grief is an important part of your healing process that can provide a lot of comfort. Please do your best to slow things down and to make time to honor your grief. Respecting grief as something important in your life moving forward may be the needed form of self-love and self-compassion to help you through it. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's such an honor to help hold space for your grief and your healing process. If you found this to be helpful, let us know. Provide us a rating and review, or send us a message at griefrefuge.com. Before saying goodbye today, I do want to remind you about downloading the Grief Refuge app. Grab that app for more grief support. Grief Refuge is a pretty amazing tool to have when grief is hitting you hard. As one of the Grief Refuge community members noted on a review, she said, "Grief Refuge is interesting and interactive. It helps me to gauge my emotions daily, which gives me a tangible sense of where I am in my grief on any given day, and that allows me to look back to see where I've come from." So if grief is making you feel lost or isolated right now, download the app for free to start feeling more comfort and support. That will do it for today. I want to thank you. I wish you well. Take care. Keep honoring your grief. Remember to be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.